The UK has been building its economic ties with China, and its Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, visiting Beijing for a 3-day trip. The visit signals a potential turning point in relations between the two nations. Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, the UK Chancellor has emphasised the importance of fostering a long-term relationship with China amid criticism over her 3-day trip. During the visit, she announced agreements projected to inject $730 million into the UK economy over the next 5 years. So, was Rachel Reeves' China trip really worth it?
China and the UK have restarted economic talks after a 6-year hiatus, with the UK's Finance Minister visiting Beijing. Chancellor Rachel Reeves travelled to Beijing with British business leaders and investors, but faced criticism for going to China amid financial turmoil at home. Reeves said the new deal signed in Beijing would bring in $730 million for the British economy.
We face a more complex and more challenging global landscape than our predecessors did when the last economic and financial dialogue took place in 2019. One with increasing conflict, including Russia's war in Ukraine, rising geopolitical tensions, and the impact of a changing climate.
Relations have soured recently following spy allegations involving a friend of Prince Andrew, the brother of King Charles. Then there's the support China has given Russia since the war in Ukraine began, and the Chinese crackdown on civil liberties in Hong Kong, a former British colony. Rachel Reeves' visit follows an effort by the new Labour government to mend relations with Foreign Secretary David Lammy travelling to China in October, and Prime Minister Keir Starmer meeting President Xi Jinping at the G20 in November. But opposition politicians and the intelligence community warn China still poses a major security threat. Will Rachel Reeves' visit end up paying off, or will this thaw in relations prove short-lived?
Let's meet our guests. Joining us from Hong Kong is Andrew Leung. He is an independent analyst on China. In Washington, D.C., we have Bennett. She's an author and lecturer in international affairs. In Sussex, in the UK, is Matthew Agarwala. He's a Bennett Professor of Sustainable Finance. That's at the Bennett Institute for Innovation and Policy Acceleration. And here with me in the studio, I'm delighted to have Vicky Pryce. She is an international economist and former UK government advisor. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Vicky, to you first, spell out to me the scale of the challenge facing Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, and her UK government. Britain is struggling.
It is. I mean, it needs to get some growth starting again. I mean, we had the second half of 2024. It looks like it was stagnant. We just got some data as well showing that, yes, a little bit of a recovery in November, but from 2 falls in the previous 2 months. So growth isn't there, and she needs to do something to rejuvenate the economy. And one of the things, of course, is trade. The problem that she's facing is that we've left the EU. The EU has been the major partner on the trade front that the UK has had for ages. It's now more difficult despite the fact there are no tariffs to export and import. That's not good news. We are striking lots of trade agreements with others. I mean, China is, of course, important as well. So
it's the obvious thing to do, isn't it, to reach out to China and try and do deals?
Yes, but of course it's in a moment when there are all sorts of problems with trade with China. So Trump intends to put very substantial extra import tariffs on anything that comes from China. There are all sorts of sanctions also, well, not exactly that, on Chinese imports or exports themselves or countries that are export to it, but it's much more that the US is quite concerned about selling products with high IP in them, intellectual property, which at the moment belongs, let's say, to the States or to other countries. So there are all sorts of restrictions that are out there. So those have been reinforced recently in a number of areas. So one has to deal with that and worry about whether Trump might put sanctions against some countries if they ignore what he's trying to do. So it is a bit of a problem. But going, as Rachel Reeves just did, just before the inauguration, just gives a signal as well that, you know, the UK is open to trade with China. And I think that's what they're trying to show. It'll be interesting to see, of course, as I suggested, what sort of pressures we might be under in the UK when Trump actually takes over as president.
Andrew, to you, I mean, going to China and trying to rebuild the relationships and get trade going with a huge global superpower, this is the obvious thing to do, surely, wasn't it?
Particularly at this time, when the whole world is facing an unpredictable Trump 2.0, which is not exactly friendly with most people, including the allies. I mean, because President Trump, President-elect, has already threatened to impose sanctions or rather tariffs on not only on China, but on Americans' allies as well. So I think that we are seeing a recalibration of relationship between a number of Western countries traditionally pushing back against China, now recalibrating its approach to China, not embracing China entirely, because there are, as highlighted just now, serious concerns on a number of fronts. But on the other hand, China does account for a significant proportion of the UK's trade. After all, is the fourth largest trading partner of the United Kingdom, accounting for 500,000 jobs. And then UK's export to China amounted to 16 billion pounds. But in terms of the proportion, is not a sizable amount of the UK export. It's only 4% of the UK's export, and also 7% of the UK's import, compared with, of course, the UK's largest trading partner, which is the United States, which accounts for 18%. But on the other hand, as I highlighted just now, the Trump 2.0 administration is a highly unpredictable and highly disruptive phenomenon. And I think that various countries are adopting a hedging kind of approach towards China. That's what's happening now.
Jan, what did you make of some of the criticism Rachel Reeves came in for in the United Kingdom for going to China? A couple of very senior Conservatives came out with very strange language. Ian Duncan Smith, former leader of the Conservative Party, he compared the trip to, and these are his words, quote, dealing with Nazi Germany in the 1930s. What do you make of that kind of rhetoric?
It's inflammatory, most definitely. It's a little extreme, if you ask me. Comparing China to Nazi Germany, I think, is provoking. So, but it is not without the relationship with China is not without concern, right? Recently, the UK imposed sanctions on China for cybersecurity breaches. And it's legitimate. These are national security concerns of the United Kingdom that the United Kingdom needs to address with China. Also, too, in 2021, the UK imposed sanctions on Chinese individuals and companies for persecuting the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, in a Western province in China. That's also concerning. And that's something else that the United Kingdom should address with China. What I would say for Reeves' visit, as well as an ongoing relationship with China, there needs to be bumpers and guardrails on that relationship. The UK needs to protect its concerns, its national security concerns, as well as protect its markets as well. You know, China's EV market, it's becoming so great that it's developing a monopoly, and that's not healthy for the British economy. And there are other products out there that China takes advantage of because they are state-owned, so that it can monopolize a particular market. So those are concerns that the British should take very seriously in a relationship with China.
Matthew, from day one, we were told Keir Starmer is a pragmatist, and he's simply doing what any pragmatic prime minister would do. He sent his Chancellor off to a huge trading partner, a global superpower, to do some deals.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. The UK does have to look to diversify its trade portfolio. We cannot rely on the US special relationship to the extent that it has been special. We cannot rely on that to remain under its current terms. I think that there is a real risk that there could be tariffs imposed on the UK from the United States. And in that sort of geopolitical framework, it is absolutely right that the UK should diversify and try to build up trade deals with countries in the rest of the world. The real back picture here, the real story underpinning all of this, though, is that the United Kingdom has placed itself, through its own national decisions, at a severe disadvantage because of Brexit, because of leaving the biggest trading bloc and trading partner that we had in the world. And the result of that is that we are now desperate for deals anywhere that they can be made, and we are the weaker partner at that negotiating table.
Vicky, the Brexit word, I don't want to keep banging on about this, but it's a big smelly elephant in the room, and it never goes away when it's got the UK economy in such flux.
Absolutely. We've seen some of the opposition leaders comment on that, just recently. So the head of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch, said herself that Brexit was happening at a time when, or at least people voted for it, or at least pushed for Brexit. They hadn't actually thought about what an alternative economic policy might be. So in other words, how to deal with what we've just been hearing.
Conservatives pushed for this,
exactly.
They delivered
Without
it,
a policy
and the whole country is suffering.
Yes, and of course the Lib Dems, the Liberal Democrats, their leader has just come out suggesting that we should be going back to the customs union at least in a few years' time. So the mood is changing. The population in general, if they were to vote today, what we hear is that they would have voted to stay rather than leave, and possibly they will at some point accept that we go back. But it's going to be a hard negotiation. But it's interesting that within this whole trade issue, our service exports have done quite well, even to the EU, from which we can take some comfort. And if you look at what's happening with the visit to China, the emphasis was very much on the financial sector and professional services sector, how one can have more access to the huge Chinese market, whether, of course, the Chinese enterprises or even the state needs deals and support, therefore, in China or in their international endeavours. I think this is a big, big win if it were possible. What we don't know really is what concessions would need to be extracted from the UK if you did that. On the trade side, on the goods side, really the main thing we managed to achieve is sign a protocol, which lots of others have already signed, which encourages more export of pork and pet food products. So that doesn't sound like huge, but nevertheless, one could come back and say, yes, there's going to be a benefit to the UK economy or the trade front. Most of it should be coming from the services side.
So in a nutshell, Vicky, Project Fear turned out to be Project Fact.
I'm afraid so, yes.
Andrew, tell me how the Chinese view the United Kingdom. I'm guessing Britain is just one of many, many countries that want to do deals and get their hands on Chinese investment.
Well, with all the pushback by the West against China, I think the relationship between China and the United Kingdom is unlikely to return to the high water mark of the David Cameron era of 2015, 2017. And now the most of the West relationship is marked by this well-worn mantra of cooperate where we can and compete where we need and challenge where we must. But against this mantra, though, there are real opportunities as the United Kingdom wants to become more global rather than just focusing on Europe, which incidentally, of course, is suffering from very heavy headwinds. None of the European economies are doing extremely well. And so looking at the East, though, there are huge opportunities. That's why the UK recently has joined the comprehensive and partnership of the Trade and Pacific Partnership. This is a huge trade bloc comprising most of the ASEAN countries and their trading partners, accounting for more than a third of the world's economy and a third of the world's population. And as far as financial services is concerned, there are talks about extending an exchange traded fund, an ETF, connecting the UK stock market with that of China. So these are huge stuff for the UK to look into. But of course, this is not a one-sided thing. China, of course, is very squared-eyed about this relationship. As I said, it's unlikely to return to the heydays of the relationship marked by the Cameron era. But I think that there are lots of opportunities for both sides to look into.
Jan, to you, this re-engagement with China, it's not without risk, as you said, but ultimately, Britain needs to do something to get this country moving again, and China was the obvious place to go.
Most certainly, that viewpoint can be taken. I would say that the UK has a similar strategy as the United States did under Biden, as well as Trump in his first administration, in investing, aligning, and competing. So the invest part, we invest where we can, and we invest in a way that is smart, align with our allies, and then compete where it's necessary. Some areas where it's necessary probably will be critical minerals and battery storage. That's both an area of geopolitical importance as well as a market, right? Battery storage is an economic market that needs to be developed in the UK. So I would say that, yes, Britain needs to engage with China strategically as well as economically, but it needs to do it in a smart way. And the United States could offer a roadmap in how it has been dealing with China.
Matthew, are people right to be a little bit kind of concerned about China in the United Kingdom when you hear people like Chris Patten, the former and last governor of Hong Kong? He said that Rachel Reeves was delusional. That was the phrase he used about our trip to Beijing. Is there veracity in what they're saying here?
Well, we should keep friends close and enemies closer. I think the reality is that the United Kingdom has to have an open approach to its economic strategy, and trade is absolutely going to be a key component of growth if we get any. I thought it was a bit charitable, Jan, for you to suggest that the UK has any sort of strategy whatsoever, which is not really what I have seen since we've had the new government come into office. I've been actually really quite surprised to see a government enter office with such a thumping parliamentary majority, but then act with such sort of universal cowardice and not actually driving forth a coherent agenda and strategy on industrial policy, on trade, on fiscal policy. And they seem to sort of just be blowing in the wind. The result of all of this is that we have to pursue opportunities everywhere they come. Yes, there are concerns about China. Yes, there are security concerns. Yes, there are human rights concerns. There are human rights and security concerns, though, with lots of other countries with whom we do trade and are looking to expand trade. That's just the facts. The reality is not every country is as warm and cuddly as we might like, and yet we still have to do business with them. The rest of the UK's economic position is not especially strong. We have a very high debt to GDP ratio at the moment. We have seen turmoil, meltdown, crisis in the bond markets. The first 2 weeks of 2025 have seen lots of activity in fixed income, which is basically never good news. What it means in reality is that the cost of borrowing to invest is rising, and that makes it that much harder to invest across the board and to fund public services. Now, that's not all down to this chancellor. The most recent turmoil in the bond market is really driven by a normalization of bond prices and yields in the United States, and that has a follow-on effect for the rest of the world. But it does affect us. It affects the cost of borrowing for public investment. If we can't do it through the Treasury, then we have to crowd it in from other countries and from the private sector.
Vicky, I see China is buying big chunks of UK national debt. Why would they be doing that?
Well, the interest rate is quite high, I suppose, is one. But also thinking maybe of diversifying away from the US, because the Chinese have also been buying loads of treasury bills, US treasury bills, and that has basically been the main source in which the US has been funding its own deficit, which, remember, yes, we've just been hearing that the UK has a large debt to GDP ratio. The US has an even bigger one, which is sort of nearly 130%. So they do need to have the Chinese. Well, if the Chinese decide not to invest any longer in US government bonds, then I'm not quite sure what the government there will do, frankly. And there's always a threat of that happening. But interest rates being so high, I mean, yes, of course, the interest rates are high in other places too, but nothing like what we're seeing, and a bit of security behind it, what we're seeing in the US and also what we're seeing in the UK as well. So that tends to be what's going on, has been going on for some time, and will continue while our borrowing costs are as high as they are.
So forgive me, national debt and the interest rates on that, who's paying that interest?
It's the government.
And the British taxpayer.
Yes, absolutely, it's us. Yes, the British taxpayer is paying for this, and it is whoever is buying the bonds who is benefiting from the interest rate which is being paid on it, which is a fixed rate. So the interesting thing is that the rate is fixed, the yields change. Of course, there are some that are index-linked, of course, and that's been a bit of a problem in the UK with inflation. So that's one of the issues that we have to deal with. But basically what the result of all this has been is that just servicing the debt, by just paying that amount of interest on it, has increased from something like, if I remember correctly, 25 billion a year at the end, just before COVID, to something like, by the end of this parliament, 110 billion a year.
So that's
which is huge. It's crippling, absolutely crippling. It's bigger than the education budget, et cetera, et cetera. So we are desperate to see those rates come down. I think one of the issues about going to China is not so much, yes, of course, we do need China as a trading partner, et cetera, but it's also that it happened right in the middle of the latest crisis that we have seen, where the pound was falling, yields have been going up, the cost of borrowing up, and everyone's starting to talk about, rather than growth in the future, what we're going to see is the government coming and cutting spending. And we'll announce that quite soon in order to do something on the fiscal front so that the markets continue to buy their bonds, rather than say that perhaps the fiscal position is unsustainable. So there's always a worry. And also, interestingly enough, Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England, also went. That, of course, reinforces what I said earlier. A lot of it to do with the financial sector and services and so on, and links with stock exchange, et cetera, with China. But it was still commented on that just as we needed perhaps the Bank of England to calm the markets down, he wasn't here either.
Andrew, if we do see a trade war between China and the United States now that Trump is back in power, is the United Kingdom likely to benefit? Would China start looking for partners and investments away from the USA?
Well, the fact that China is buying UK debt says a great deal about the recalibration of China's buying the too much U.S. Treasuries. In fact, if we look at the China's holding of U.S. Treasuries, it's going down, but in fact, it's diverting this excess of China's export earnings and to put into countries relatively more trusted by Beijing. For example, this, as you mentioned just now, investing in UK debt. Now, there's also an opportunity that, in fact, that apart from trade, the UK could attract more investments from China, and then creating a lot of jobs. When I visited the UK last year during the summer, I was very pleased to see that London's traditional black taxis, the LEVC, the C stands for commentary, where there's all the black taxis are being manufactured inside the UK, creating UK jobs. So I think that, again, the China's EV industry is threatening the survival of a lot of vehicle industries across Europe and elsewhere. And China's now trying to address this problem by investing in manufacturing in other countries. So instead of made in China, it's now owned by China or jointly owned by China. And this is a good thing. This is a kind of win-win situation. The last thing I like to mention is there's a great deal of misunderstanding that China is about state capitalism, and then the private sector plays very little, but without being aware that, in fact, the private sector inside China accounts for 50% of China's tax, 60% of China's GDP. 70% of China's innovation, 80% of China's employment, and 90% of the number of enterprises. So I think that China's model is a kind of paradox. I mean, it's unlike any other model. But again, if you look carefully, there are win-win opportunities for both sides.
And just, Jan, final point to you. Given the perilous state of the UK economy, flatlining along, no ideas, no energy, no growth, Rachel Reeves, she was right to go to Beijing, wasn't she?
I would say yes, she was right to go to Beijing. However, again, as I mentioned, there should be guardrails and bumpers in that relationship. And that's something that both Starmer and Reeves should take into account when they deal with China, when they're negotiating with China, is that they do have national security concerns. And there are also concerns about, aligning our values with China. The British concerns about human rights, they're valid, and we would like to I'm not British, so the British should advance those interests as however they can with China in that relationship.
Jan, Matthew, Andrew and Vicky here with me in the studio. Thank you all so much for your insight on this one. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.